Thank you. All right. Very good to see everybody this morning. Glad to have you here in Bible class with us as we move forward in John 18, picking up in verse 28. Last week we ended in a discussion about Peter and his denial and breaking down different elements of it, points of discussion, and making sure that as we are going through this material that is, I'm sure, very familiar to most of us, that we're not making the mistake that, well, I know what this is about, I know what's going on, and therefore there's nothing left for me to gain from it. We do not need to become so familiar with this material that we're going through. It's just, okay, yeah, this is where Peter denies, and yes, Jesus looks upon him after he denies, and the cock crows, so on and so forth. There's plenty of significance in this, and there's plenty of application as we are dissecting this and viewing Peter in this difficult situation, and as we are going through and we're seeing the actions of the chief priest and the Jews and their dirty deeds that they're involved in performing so as to have their will be performed, and that in killing the Son of God. And we closed last time in bringing out these really good points about Peter, closing with his redemptive qualities, being able to learn from his mistakes, the lobster lesson. Anybody go back and dig into that? Man, what's wrong with y'all? I know you've seen it. We've talked about it. All right. Huh? Yeah. And then we also talked about this redemptive quality and his being able to grow from his mistakes, and we discussed how that's a difficult element for everybody to go through. And then as we consider further, just a few other points, contrasting the denial of Peter and the betrayal of Judas. Peter's willing to correct the mistake. All right, there's one side of the coin. Judas is the other. Judas is going to go out and he's going to hang himself. And this is Peter illustrating, giving us a picture of that godly sorrow. Judas, the sorrow of the world, in 2 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 10. How it is that Peter fell through weakness and not actions that are premeditated. Peter was overtaken by unseen snares while Judas went into the events with his eyes wide open. And then when we're thinking about the situation of Peter, just how easy it would have been for him to go the other direction. For him to go in a similar way as Judas, maybe not to that extreme of, well, I'm going to go out and hang myself. But Peter could have fallen into deep despair over these actions. I mean, after all of the bragging that he's done up to this point, and now look what he's done. At this stage, he could have just walked away, and not in the frame of mind that we're fixing to read about here in just a moment, where he's going to say, I go fishing. He just could have walked away completely and not been brought back. And just considering what's going through his mind at this point, that, okay, I've done all this bragging, now I've messed up this way. The other apostles would have heard him involved in his bragging. Now, how am I supposed to go back and face the other apostles? They heard all of his big talk, and now his reputation is going to be destroyed. Now, these are all negative thoughts that we could potentially have, but just because they are thoughts that we're having, how much of them are actually true? Yeah.
So maybe he's used to that, and maybe he can handle the fact that, oh yeah, here I did it again, and I opened my mouth, and it wasn't as devastating as it could be to maybe others who weren't in the process
Yeah, yeah. So there is some of that to where it's just okay. People, the potential that people are going to have an understanding mind that, okay, this isn't the first time Peter's done something like this. And even to this degree, if everybody else is thinking about it correctly, as we discussed last week, all right, who's to say that I would have done any better? But as we find ourselves in these positions, we spiral like this. Now, this is not only an over-exaggeration of the harm and the bad that Peter has done, but with that last point of, well, how am I supposed to go back and face the other apostles? My reputation is going to be ruined with them at this point. What does that say about how we think about how Peter, if that is going through his mind, what does that say about what Peter thinks of the other apostles?
He doesn't trust them.
Okay. He does not trust them to actually do the very thing that Jesus has been talking about back in chapter 13. You need to be willing to love like I love. And that you're going to be willing to forgive like I forgive. He's ultimately saying, if that were going through his mind, and this goes through our minds, that's what we're saying about everybody else. And so, this is one of the big points that I was making with the situation back in Virginia, and my dad trying to cover up all of his sins. And he was making those kind of statements, that by me going and telling the brethren what he did, because he wasn't going to tell them, he had said that I had ruined his reputation. So what you're ultimately saying is you don't trust the brethren to forgive, to try to understand and try to help you through this. Well, that's what despair does, and that's what sin does. Sin creates fear.
Fear leads to suffering.
Exactly. And Peter could have, through whatever means, we see him in this situation already trying to deny and cover up that he's an apostle. After all of this was over, nobody else was there around to hear what he said. Could have just tried to cover it up once he got back. Oh yeah, they questioned me, but buddy, I stood my ground. Well, who was there to hear you?
John in the background.
Right.
Oh, this is going to be good.
Yeah. And then just could have thrown up his hands. Why try at this stage? Look at the mess that I've made. Now, we are at a great advantage in that while we are reading about this, we're able to take time to break it down and to consider just how serious the consequences are of our actions. But how often do we stop to consider those kind of consequences before we actually go about and follow through with certain actions?
Well, when you get older and you learn from your mistakes, maybe more so than when you're younger.
Okay?
If you only that you don't know.
All right. But most of the time, nobody is stopping to consider. Well, okay, what consequences might I have to suffer in going through and committing the sin that I'm about to commit? Nobody's thinking about, Peter's not thinking about all of this when he's being called on the carpet. Well, what are the apostles going to think? What about this? What about that? And a lot of times we find ourselves in situations where we don't have that kind of time. Now we can stop and take the kind of time to potentially do it, but we have to, again, recognize the point we're discussing last week about these little things that we're viewing as just being everyday occurrences and that are not, in our mind, all that important, can have really heavy consequences.
When this is happening to him, and Jesus has told him, when you come back,
Mm.
with them,
Yeah.
and this is just one moment where he's choosing to lie. He's choosing to openly
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right, so how would we go about in explaining that?
We've talked about it in previous lessons. I just can't remember exactly what you said, but it was that we're too hard on ourselves
Mm-hmm.
and others.
Mm-hmm.
That how God loves us is more than
Mm-hmm.
we think. And even when we were talking about, I think it was last week. I can't remember, but yeah, it was in my head.
He does repent. And like you said at the beginning, Peter learned and grew from this incident. But at this specific moment, let's say it was another moment like that Jesus came back and caught him in this sin. Where does he stand?
Mm-hmm.
I believe you also said we grow from our mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
So this is one of those moments where you do something and you're finding out, okay, I don't like what just happened, and the difference between Judas and Peter was just that, okay, I need to do something about that. I need to do something about this
Mm-hmm.
in a positive way instead of Judas going, well, I just give up. So, not having that faith in Jesus to forgive you. So Judas didn't have that faith in Jesus to forgive. So just like we're talking about how Peter could have looked at the apostles and how he viewed the apostles of, well, they're not going to forgive me, so you don't have to trust in the apostles.
Mhm.
He goes with Jesus. With Peter is, well, I messed up. What can I do to regain myself? Have a seat back at the table. So there's a difference in character here.
We'll understand that he panicked, he was ensnared, whereas Judas plotted.
Okay. And a lot of the problem comes in with how we've had sermons being presented and in using certain passages in describing, so one of the major ones, Isaiah, and what he has to say to Israel there, and how that, it's a, God's not even, he's not listening to their prayers, he's sick of their worship, on and on with the list. But is that even a proper description for what we have being discussed here with Peter, with what Isaiah is saying to the nation of Israel at that time? And for that matter, would it be found in real application to most of a congregation as it's being used? More than likely not, because Isaiah is describing a people that is corrupt and sick from the top of their head to the sole of their feet. Well, that's not a Peter. It would be a good description of Judas. I mean, he was a thief the whole way through. He's somebody that's not been converted. And just because he's there with Jesus does not mean that he's one of the ones that's actually with Jesus. So that when we're considering this element in this discussion, we're not needing to look at the situation of, well, okay, I've sinned this one time, so therefore I'm like this person who's out in the world. That's ridiculous. But that's what a lot of people end up doing. And that's a lot of the presentation that's given in the sermons. The difference is going to be the Romans 6 discussion as to whom or to what are you yielding yourself servants to serve? To sin and death, or to righteousness and life? Well, I'm yielding myself a servant to righteousness. Well, does that mean that you're no longer going to sin? No, that's not what that means. I am going to sin, but that sin, I do not then have to categorize myself as somebody who's being cast out because of that sin. Now, it has the potential to do that if I'm not going to follow through with what God says I'm supposed to do with that sin. And that in being a Christian, I'm supposed to repent and confess. And then I'll be forgiven. Well, okay, what if I choose not to do that? Well, now I'm finding myself in a category of a Judas. That I'm not going to seek after God, but I'm actually going to run away from Him. Well, if you're running away from God, there's no grace. But if you run towards God, then there can be grace. And even with the picture that's given throughout the Old Testament, the fact of them having to offer sacrifices every day, and that for sins that were committed willingly and even sins that were committed ignorantly. But with all of that was going on, and they're having to offer those sins every day, does that mean that they were constantly in and out? Well, now I'm an Israelite, now I'm not an Israelite because these things are being done? No. So a lot of what's ended up happening is having to battle against the denominational arguments, and then also being afraid to present grace as it's actually supposed to be presented. That with Peter here, and the realization that God has, okay, you're going to do this. And that's what we discussed last week. Jesus knew full well what He was going to do, and He even told Peter what He's going to do. And that in knowing He was going to do that, and that Jesus tells him ahead of time, I've prayed for you that your faith is not going to fall. So in this event, and I guess that would be a good point in bringing it in connection as to in or out situation, did Peter let his faith fall? No. Whereas with Judas, he did. He stopped trusting. But Peter, in realizing his mistake, but he didn't stop trusting. And he stuck with the apostles, and he's there when Jesus comes back.
Would an illustration to go with it, a good one, be the prodigal son?
Okay.
Because he left, but he's still the son. So when he returns, and I've had this conversation in the past with a friend of mine where the question was, do you need to be baptized every time
Right.
you sin or fall away, whatnot? My answer was no, because when you become a child, even if you walk away and then you come back, you're still the child.
Mm-hmm.
God will accept you if you repent and come back to the fold. So this be the same thing where what we're talking about, same thing that we're talking about, where you're still a part of the fold even if you've gone away, and when you come back, and then as you said, chase towards God, there should be grace for you.
Yeah.
And if you run away, there is no grace.
That's a good illustration with the prodigal son, and I guess just the difficulties in our mind of, well, how can somebody still be a Christian and do these things? Because normally we would say, well, if you're doing these things, you're not a Christian. And that is more than likely bad verbiage on our part, because they are still Christians. They are still a brother, even though they've been withdrawn from disfellowship, so on and so forth, and they're in this sin. And that's the problem that the denominational world has. Well, how can you be a child of God and do these things? Easy.
Watch me.
Yeah. Hold my beer. But that's where that conflict comes in. It's just, well, if you're a Christian, you're not supposed to be doing these things, so therefore if you are doing these things, you're no longer a Christian. that's wrong terminology, and that's the wrong way of thinking about it.
Can you throw in another word as you're describing what you just said when we can call a Christian an unbeliever? They're still our Christian brethren because they obeyed the faith at one time, but then their actions, their fruit, and everything shows them to be an unbeliever. So as an unbeliever, it's just so you can call a Christian.
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
How do you choose to live your life there? You designated if you're a believer or an unbeliever.
Right. And that's, yeah, so again, that's just where we have to be more careful in our terminology. And just not being too fast in our talking, and then also in presuming that people are understanding what we're actually talking about.
I was just thinking, because the brethren that have fallen away, there's rules for them.
Mm-hmm.
So with disfellowship, can't eat with them. There is that rule there. So if they become an unbeliever or go back to worldly enticings, they're still a Christian because
Right.
the rest of the world we don't do that to.
Right.
So there is that separation
Yeah.
between the two.
Yeah. Okay. Any other thoughts on that point? All right. Let's see here. Oh, okay. So a little bit more with Peter. We also are learning from Peter what cowardice does. Fear, that element of being scared. But we're also going to find, similar points on this when we start discussing Pilate also. Fear causes a person to avoid difficult situations. You'll end up trying to give up due to overwhelming circumstances. You'll start worrying about and be concerned about the reproaches of others. And we don't see this with Peter, but we will see it with Pilate, in that with Pilate, it will push you to a bad form of compromise, in seeking to compromise. And ultimately what it's doing is it's stifling conviction. And when we're thinking about this from the standpoint of application for us today, this is a great danger in connection with preachers and teachers. And the danger is of allowing influences of others to keep me and to keep others from teaching what is needing to be taught. And even in my short time of preaching compared to others that have been involved in this practice, and I've already had to face my own difficulties of teaching lessons that are needing to be taught but would not be appreciated. And that is just, can't teach that here. Can't do that here. I'll make this person upset. All right, what am I going to do? Am I going to stand on my conviction of what I know the truth is? And am I going to trust what God's Word says, and that if you send it out, it won't return void? That the Word will be able to do what it's supposed to do, either bring that person to repentance and salvation if they're not a Christian, and if they are a Christian living in rebellion, it'll cut them out. That's not a bad thing. But most individuals would buckle under that. Yeah. Present it when they want it. You present it when they don't want it. It's the difficulty in standing firm and also standing firm in the proper attitude. But in teaching, what you know needs to be taught anyways, if it even means that these individuals might turn their back on you. And especially, this is difficult when it comes to holding a view on something that is not commonly held by brethren in general. So we've got somebody in the midst of, possibly spreading rumors as to what my position is on marriage, divorce, and remarriage. And I'll readily admit that, more than likely, my position is not in lockstep with most brethren. I'm not concerned with that, unless they can show me from the scriptures as to where I'm out of line. But most people, in having that understanding is, these brethren over here, they don't hold that view, so I'm going to be secretive as to what my view is. If I believe what I have is the truth, then I need to stand by it. No matter what name finds itself being in opposition to the position. In which that even goes into the Corinthian letter, I believe it's the 2 Corinthian letter, where Paul has to reprove those brethren because they had that very mentality. Where Paul ends up stating, I don't have any letters to give to you as to why you're needing to listen to me. And we're not measuring each other by each other in that kind of way so as to find out, who am I actually supposed to be listening to? But that's what a lot of brethren do today. Well, what does this brother have to say on it? Or what does this person have to say on it? Well, if they hold that position, then it must be okay with me. It's the wrong way of measuring. But that's the way most brethren deal with it. And that even goes into some of the conversations that we've had, that most of our brethren are not even familiar with what the text actually teaches. They're more familiar with what brother so-and-so says about it. Before they pick up their Bible to find out what the Bible says on an issue, they'll pick up a commentary. Or they'll pick up some brother's book on the topic and allow that person to establish their belief for them. And that's the wrong place to start. So from there, any other thoughts that you have about Peter on this line and the difficult situation he's having? Well, every single one of us can find ourselves in a situation like Peter. You're at work, you're at the grocery store, you're here, you're there, and something ends up happening, or it's not even a situation necessarily where you have to be asked a direct question or where you're called on the carpet with anything. But it's just an occasion, an event to where I could potentially have an influence on the situation. And I have to make a choice as to what I'm going to do about it. Whether I'm going to, say something, or whether I'm going to act in a certain way so as to show approval, disapproval, what have you. And it's in those little moments that we have to make those decisions that will then define what we'll do in the big moments. So I think I've used this story as illustration before in the past, but we'll use it here again. When Sam Walton, the owner of Walmart, was looking for somebody to take over the business and they were doing interviews, they would normally take the interviewee out to lunch at this restaurant, and it was cafeteria style. Take your tray, your plate, put whatever food you wanted on your plate, and then you paid for it at the end. Well, with one of the gentlemen being interviewed, Sam Walton noticed that when he got towards the end of the line and you're taking your utensils and everything like that, that he snuck a piece of butter onto his tray, and you were supposed to pay for it, and he didn't. Well, they sat down, had lunch, went through the interview, and at the end of the interview, Sam Walton said, "We're not hiring this guy." They asked him why, and he said, "Well, I saw him steal a pack of butter there at the end of the line." Well, everybody else was kind of confused by it. What's the big deal? It's just a pack of butter. And Sam Walton's response was, if a person's willing to steal something small, then you best believe they'll steal something big when the opportunity presents itself. The little things, the little decisions carry big impact. What you got, Jamie?
I can't hold back a smile, but I sense a recurring theme with stories.
Yeah. No, that's good. It's good that you're having that callback. And that's the power of illustrations. So that's to help us remember these different points. Okay, moving on, 28. Then led they Jesus from Caiaphas unto the hall of judgment, and it was early, and they themselves went not into the judgment hall, lest they should be defiled, but that they might eat the Passover. Now, verse 28 is going to start a chain of events that will run all the way through John 19:16. So John 18:28 starts a section that's going to conclude John 19:16. So here they are, and now they go to the right place before the right person. They're gone before Caiaphas unto the hall of judgment. It's where they should have been the whole entire time, but remember they went to Annas first, and then they're going to end up going to Pilate. Now this is a point we've made in our Matthew study, but we need to make it again since we're here in the text, and repetition is the best teacher. Just notice the inconsistency. They take him unto the hall of judgment, and it was early, and they themselves went not into the judgment hall, and here's the reason why. Lest they should be defiled, but that they might eat the Passover. Just look at that hypocrisy. And it establishes, once again, that they have no true understanding about the Passover. Oh, they knew what the Scriptures taught, and they knew when they were supposed to take it, how they're supposed to take it. Here are the rules and here's the regulations. But just as we studied in John 2, John 6, and then in John 13, and the washing of feet and that in connection of the Passover, they have lost all understanding and meaning behind this Passover feast. They are worried about going into the judgment hall, and this is where Pilate's going to be. So now we're going to be mixing in with Gentiles. Oh, well, we can't do that. And we know how serious that is from the book of Acts. Acts chapter 10, Peter goes, teaches Gentiles. He comes back, and he's called on the carpet. For what reason?
He went in with the Gentiles.
Not that he went in and taught. He went in and ate with Gentiles. This is a serious matter. And especially during the time of Passover. Because if we're going in here and when we're mixing in with Gentiles, what might there be in this judgment hall aside from the Gentiles?
Pork.
No, not pork.
Sinners.
Okay.
Uncircumcised people.
That'd be Gentiles. What's a key specification in connection with the Passover? Leaven. You sweep your house.
I want you to point to Bryn more often because she has answers and she just doesn't talk.
Well, Ethan's in the way, so I can't see around his big head if her mouth moves.
Yeah. She didn't raise anything. You just need to see her face.
Okay.
When you talk, she'll call her out.
Well, that's good. So 2 of you got it. We can't go into this place because there might be leaven. And that will, God's commanded us. We're not supposed to have leaven in our house. Not supposed to be around leaven. And if we're around leaven, that's going to corrupt us. Really? That's what you're worried about? Now, is that something that they should be worried about?
Well, yeah.
Yes, that's part of God's command. But what about this other stuff?
Jesus already said they're dead.
Exactly. What about the fact that you are, everything that's gone up to this point, you've conspired to murder a man with no real trial, no evidence, without any cause. And they're going to say very shortly to Pilate, we have a law that says he should die. Okay, where's the evidence for your crime? We have none. And you think leaven is going to be the thing that corrupts you? But don't people play this game all the time? Here they are, involved in A, B, C, D. Oh, well, that's not so bad. God's not going to condemn me for that. But then here's this little thing, if we can call it that for the moment. Here's this other element that stands in the place for all these other things that you're involved in. Oh, I can't do that. That is straining at gnats and swallowing camels. But again, we have being illustrated for us the importance of balance between ritual and application. They had the ritual. They had religion without spirituality. They are watching, I'm getting ahead of myself. We have people today that are making the same, or they're wanting to make this claim. Well, I can have Jesus without religion. Why are they saying that? They're saying this and thinking this way because of what is happening in our John study right here is still happening today. They are watching people go through the motions. They are watching people go through their ritual, go through their ceremonies, and be just as corrupt as they were before. There is no real change. And the sad part is that that's even being seen inside the churches of Christ. And what we are needing to remember, and what we're trying to emphasize to our community around us, is that everything that God commands us to do in Christianity is designed to change how we live every day. But when Christianity is treated like this, what we're reading about here in John 18, that person is no closer to God than the person who never obeys the gospel. Both are far away. And again, we're not needing to lose sight of this just because, we know what's happening here. This event being recorded for us to be able to read and study is designed to change everything about us. I'm not wanting to be like this. Well, then we need to remember why we're doing the things that we're doing. It's not just because God commanded us to be here and to go through these things and to study and to worship like we're going to. Everything is designed for a purpose, and the purpose is for us to change. The very fact of him going through these things and him dying was for the purpose was to save us. But his death is only going to save us if it has an effect on us. And for most people, it does not. For too many people today, it has no real effect. But then also, it's kind of just a thought that I had in connection with this. It's a bit of a rabbit, but I thought at least it was interesting to consider. This problem that the Jews are having at this point might help explain and be part of the reason why Christianity is so simple. Because here's a law-given feast, but that law in observance of this feast could be violated in so many ways. Touching a dead body or anything that was dead would make you ceremonially unclean to where you could not observe this. Going into a house that had leaven in it would make you ceremonially unclean. A woman during her cycle would make you ceremonially unclean to where you could not observe this. All of these things are a possibility so as to defile a person and keeping them from observing the feast. But yet Christianity has just a few things that are commanded for us in worship. And could it not be for the sole purpose of not getting lost in the nuance of all of this? To where, that's one of the things that people oftentimes a question that they'll raise about the New Testament in contrast with the Old Testament. Why do we not have as much detail in the New Testament about how worship is as it's laid out in the Old Testament system? Not really sure, aside from the fact that to a large degree, I'm thankful that we don't have to follow all of those things that they had to follow under the Old Testament system. Right. Yeah, definitely. I mean, you just think about before they had the temple, they had the tabernacle. And as they are moving through the wilderness on the way to the promised land, and even with how splendid the tabernacle would have been, that would have been a sight to see. But can you imagine having to pack that thing up, carry it with you everywhere you go, and then unpack it, and then set everybody up in the exact order that God said you're supposed to do every single time you stopped? Yeah, I would have gotten sick of that after day 2.
We're already 5 years into our tents and we're having somebody else set
Right, exactly. And then even down to the specifications on how you're supposed to carry stuff. Now, on one hand, that would be helpful, and that's okay, what does God want us to do? Well, okay, here it is, lined out for you. But man alive, the tent, the vessels, just the ark, the people marching in proper order. It's like, you really want all that? This is far better. This is way better. And that I don't have to travel a great distance to a set location. I don't have to go to Jerusalem to worship in that manner. As long as we're brought together with people that are Christians, that are of like precious faith, that are following and keeping the doctrine, we can meet anywhere. And that opens up possibility. It just makes it that much easier for us. But still, we face that similar danger of allowing the actions to be ritual that do not hit at our hearts. All that we do in worship is intended to change us, and that through the renewing of our minds. It's having us think about certain things, call to remembrance certain elements. And that's the problem that the Jews have had for a long time. I mean, here are people that have studied the Old Testament, they've been involved in teaching the Old Testament, they're leading the people, and yet they do not understand what the truth is. I mean, here's the Word in the flesh before their very eyes. And they don't know it. It's not because they cannot know it. It's just because they do not want to know it. And so that's a warning for all of us. And that when we decide to do what we want, or when we decide that we're going to have the Bible teach what we want, then we're going to end up missing the truth. And that'll be further shown as we see the back and forth between the Jews and Pilate, starting in verse 29. Pilate then went out unto them and said, What accusation bring ye against this man? All right, let me hear the evidence. Let me hear the case. They answered and said unto him, If he were not a malefactor, we would not have delivered him up unto thee. How ridiculous. Okay, we're going to have a trial. There's got to be a trial. You've brought him in here. Let's have the case. In order to have a trial, you must have a charge. Must have an accusation. And just look at the trouble that they're having in bringing an accusation against him. They've already made it up in their minds that he's going to die. And Pilate asks, why does he need to die? And it's just, well, isn't it obvious? We're here in front of you. If he wasn't guilty of something, we wouldn't have brought him. Well, what is it? They can't come up with it. And their reasoning is, well, we've brought him here before you, so he must have done something wrong, and that should satisfy you. Why do we have to prove anything to you? Doesn't that sound familiar? If you're going to hold something to be factual, you've got to give some evidence. And they're laying this out to Pilate. Well, hey, you just need to carry out this sentence that we've already determined and that we've already established. Now, this is a positive point to Pilate, if you will, and unfortunately, this is how a lot of people behave themselves. Well, okay, here are the Jews. They're bringing him before Pilate, and they're saying, we want him to die. It would be very easy to say, well, okay, put him to death. You guys have already found it out. But Pilate doesn't do that. Pilate carries out an investigation. He does not let the fact of, well, here are these Jewish leaders, and they're coming here saying that he's guilty. He must be guilty. Pilate actually starts to look into it. So he's doing more than what most people will do.
Do you ever wonder if he's doing that just to irritate the Jews because they are kind of a thorn in the side of Rome?
Potentially, yeah. Yeah. Just throwing out a stumbling block or a hurdle for them to have to jump over. But then also, I would say too, with Pilate, I mean, he's finding himself in a very sticky political situation. And that while that could be one possibility, the other possibility is, well, hey, if I don't investigate and I end up putting an innocent man to death, that's going to come down on him from the other side. So either way you're going in this, it's a tough spot to be in. So then verse 31, then said Pilate unto them, okay, take ye him and judge him according to your law. It's obvious. You've already made up your mind. You're saying that he's guilty. You've already decided. Then you kill him according to your law. But then again, the hypocrisy of the Jews here. The Jews therefore said unto him, it is not lawful for us to put any man to death. So Pilate is ultimately saying, well, if this is some religious problem with you guys, well, then you see to it and you handle it. But they're not wanting to do that because they do not want to be, they're being put in a bind here because they're not wanting to carry the blame. They know that he's innocent, and they're not wanting to lay a hand on him. They want to be able to shift blame to somebody else. Oh, you see, the Romans, they did it. And they're still playing that game today. I mean, and this ought to be a wake-up call as to where we're headed in our country with all the anti-Semitic laws that they're trying to pass. It's getting to the point to where we cannot correctly say who killed Jesus in our country, because that's being labeled as anti-Semitism. Well, you just hate Jewish people by saying that. It's the truth. And most of them today would still promote and say, well, if Jesus were here and he tried to pull that stuff, they'd kill him. So I don't see what the problem is.
I'm just thinking that these laws may come into effect, but they could be overturned and gone up to the Supreme Court. But we already have a lot that protects people with their speech or whatever.
Right.
So it could be free speech, but it could have consequences.
Mm-hmm.
You're destroying buildings.
Right. Yeah.
But I agree.
Right. So, but then to their point, it is not lawful for us to put any man to death. That's interesting. Because is that a true statement?
No.
Are you sure? Okay. It would depend on what law you're talking about. If they are talking about from the standpoint of Roman law, then okay, potentially what they're saying is accurate. However, with what Pilate is already saying, well, this is a matter of your law, then you see to it. You carry out the consequences of what your law says. Okay, what was the punishment for the majority of their laws? Stoning. You're going to be put to death. So this is a dodge. If it is not lawful for you to put a man to death, then why were you trying to do it earlier? How many times have we already studied and read about how they wanted to lay hands on him? Oh, can't do that. Not lawful for you to do that. But they're willing to do it then. How was it that Herod was able to kill one of the apostles in Acts chapter 12? How was it lawful for them to kill Stephen? Acts chapter 7.
Because it was outside the city.
Yeah. How was it that Saul was able to get his letters to go and persecute Christians if it's not lawful for them to do that? Oh, it's plenty lawful for them to do it. They just don't want to have the blame.
Then
Exactly. John 8. The woman caught in adultery. And even Jesus in that situation was willing to follow the law if they were going to follow it justly. All right, you without sin, you pick up the first stone. So Pilate's already answered this untruth by saying, no, you see to it. You handle it. But then verse 32 shows how there's bigger plans at play. This is happening that the saying of Jesus might be fulfilled, which he spake, signifying what death he should die. Jesus has already been foretelling of his crucifixion. And if the Jews were going to punish him, what's the method? It's stoning. All right, that does not fit into prophetic statement. It has to be through the means of crucifixion. So then it has to be done by the Romans. But here they are, and they're just trying to pass blame. They're trying to pass the buck. They're trying to pass on responsibility. Verse 33, then Pilate entered into the judgment hall again and called Jesus and said unto him, Art thou the king of the Jews? Jesus answered him, Sayest thou this thing of thyself? Or did others tell it thee of me? And we'll have to pick up there next week on this discussion and John's recording of it and the important role that it plays in properly understanding the mission that Christ had in coming into the world, and part of that mission being the establishment of his kingdom. And what kind of king and kingdom he came to establish. And we'll dive into some pre-mill stuff, answering 1,000-year reign, everything like that. In going through this, even with the short answers that Jesus is going to give here to Pilate, and how with these short answers ends up unraveling entire doctrines that people are holding on to today as to what they are still hoping to have accomplished. But yet Jesus is going to illustrate and confirm, even in this teaching to Pilate, and there again, here's Jesus trying to teach a Gentile of things concerning the kingdom. So there's going to be a good bit of information in here that we need to take time to consider and bring into application. So any questions up to verse 32 and the beginning section, introduction of Jesus before Pilate?
Why did it have to be crucifixion? You don't know?
Other than that's what God had prophesied, and I suppose also just the cruel and inhumane method of it, and that having its connection over with the penalty of sin, like just how severe and how bad sin is, would be part of it.
Just a slicing of the throat, and you die.
Yeah. And so even from that standpoint, that would be a better illustration and better connection, if I can say it that way, of the Passover lamb, because that's what you would have done in sacrificing the lamb, slitting the throat, pouring out the blood, and placing it on the altar to be burned. Yeah, that could have possibly had more connection, but we're going this route. Huh? Right. So yeah, as far as to the deep down why, don't really know, but I mean, there's some possibilities on it. All right, we'll stop.